security policies and or firewall rule sets, if you will, and how they get dirty, right? What is the cause of that? Let's get into this. So one area, and we've seen this, is less than disciplined rule-based management. Maybe the organization doesn't follow any sort of practice when it comes to managing a firewall rule sets. Maybe they're not regulated, and therefore what we're going to find is over time that the rule set will get mismanaged and will become something that's very difficult to work with. And then you might have an environment where you have different network security engineers that are managing the rule set, and each one has their own take on how it should be done. So again, this is the too many cooks in the kitchen scenario, where they're not all in agreement with how something should be done, and therefore one person may be creating overly permissive rules, and the other one might be creating too many rules, that sort of thing. So it's really the concept of too many cooks in the kitchen. One I've seen in my past is when you have to make an emergency change. Emergency changes, typically you don't put a lot of thought into how the change should be implemented. You're trying to maybe re-enable the business. So you might add in a very, very permissive rule to get the business up and running. And then you're going to go back and fix it later on. Well, that later on never happens, right? So now you have a rule in there that's just too permissive, which it's not good either. And then as time goes by, you may have assets like servers on your network that are being retired and removed from the network, but we never go back to the firewall rules and remove those objects from the rules themselves, right? So there's a challenge there. And we'll be talking to that one a little later on in this presentation. And then last, when we deal with firewall rule sets that have been there for a while, we have a lot of legacy rules. Perhaps the purpose of the rule is not fully understood by those that are managing the rule set now, and they're reluctant to do cleanups because, quite frankly, they're afraid to break the business, right? They don't want to break an application, and so therefore the rules stay there until they figure out why the rule's there. So why are network security policies cleanup necessary? We see how the rule sets get dirty, and we've listed a few items, but why is it important to clean them up? The most obvious is it restores order, right? And when you have a rule set that's understood, that's important. So we're going to restore some semblance of order. And then, of course, as we start removing these legacy rules or overly permissive rules or shadow rules even, we start getting in a position where now the rule set becomes more concise. And as a result, now we have reduced the attack surface, also very important. Less rules, better organized rules, also yields better performance. And then, if you are subject to audit, for instance, I mentioned before PCI, but there are others, right? So if you're subject to audit, then having a well-managed and well-maintained rule set makes your audit journey a lot easier to deal with, right? And you shouldn't be managing your rule set in a proper manner just to pass audit. It should be a practice that you do all the time, not just when audit season happens. And then, when it comes to troubleshooting, right? If you have a rule set that has, rules that are all over that aren't well managed, and you're trying to troubleshoot why a connection is broken, that's going to be difficult. But if you have very purposeful rules in your rule set, now it starts becoming a little easier, right? You know what each rule does, and it'll be easier to pinpoint why perhaps a connection has been broken. And then, when you're perhaps moving from one security provider, from one firewall vendor, let's say, to another, what you don't want to be doing is you don't want to migrate rules that aren't necessary, right? Rules that are shadowed, rules that are overly permissive. So it's always best practice before you do the migration is to go through and clean up the rule set, right? Let's only migrate those rules that are truly necessary to the new platform. Okay, let's continue on then. So what does network security policy cleanup include, right? What are the different things you need to do? Well, quite often, and most of you probably are aware of some of these anyhow, but deleting unused rules. Find those rules that have not been used for a period of time, and whatever that is in your organization, and let's get rid of them if they're not providing any kind of business function. But if they are providing a business function, like I think of a disaster recovery rule as an example, if you have a DR rule and it's not being hit because you haven't had a DR event, then you want to make sure you document that, right? That this rule is serving a business function, even though it's not been hit. And that's, that would be important. Deleting fully shadowed rules, right? And we'll have an example on this, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but again, best practice and reduces risk. Identifying disabled rules and getting rid of them, again, if they're not providing any kind of business function. You might say, show me all my disabled rules that have not been modified in any way for the last 90 days. That means they've been disabled for at least 90 days. Maybe those would be subject to cleanup as well, okay? And then let's take a look at the rule base itself and reordering it. So in this case, reordering the rule base doesn't necessarily impact a security posture, but it does make your rule base more efficient. And as a result, performance will be better on the network security device on which those rule bases exist. So making sure that we have the rule base in order where most used rules are at the top, least used rules are at the bottom. And then, of course, identifying obsolete rules, similar to unused rules, but obsolete rules would be rules that aren't serving any kind of business function. They may be being hit, but not for the purpose and not for the intent that they were put in there. So we need to have some means of going through and identifying rules that aren't serving a business function and having those rules removed. And, again, this is kind of a normal thing from a readability perspective, but ensuring that our object names have some sort of a convention that makes sense to us, right? And removing unneeded network objects. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Okay. Finally, one of the areas that that you want to look at from a cleanup perspective is looking at permissive rules, right? Rules that are overly permissive. We talked about earlier, maybe the rule that was put in as an emergency measure, and having that rule tightened down, right? Making sure that rule is only allowing the access it needs to allow, not full access. So identifying and then also tightening up overly permissive rules.